So as you may have gathered from what I said earlier and from the song, this month's theme is around abundance, prosperity, wealth, bounty. To start this month, I wanted us to examine the concept of abundance and how we can approach it. So I've given you this little sheet. And the invitation I'm going to give you is using 4 lines. How could you connect all 9 dots?
Can you cross?
You can do whatever you want. Yes.
Oh, without raising the pen, right?
Oh. Yeah.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Oh.
That's a beautiful design, though.
Okay, forget that one.
That's never mind because I saw the result, so I know
Now
how
I'm
it goes.
embarrassed. I should have known.
Don't be
No,
embarrassed.
I didn't, wasn't clear enough.
Now, do you have to use 4?
Yes.
No.
Oh,
That's-
you're doing less?
No, it has to be 4 lines, straight lines, without
Straight
lifting
line
up your
without
pen.
lifting the pen.
Yeah, I got it.
I don't
So
think
that's
it's
why.
possible.
It's possible.
And once you see it, you'll understand why I'm having you play with it like this.
Puzzles.
I kind of cheated.
But you're lifting up the pen,
No,
and they all have to connect. Which means you have this little lovely one, these 2 aren't connected. They all have to touch.
Well.
Dan's like,
You sound so disgusted.
Sorry.
So where are people with this process?
No, I don't, I just.
Okay, does somebody who has accomplished it want to show it? Because I do have a little video that runs through a process. Do you want get up? You can explain it.
Oh.
I have a different solution.
Oh, there's more than one solution?
Say that again.
Oh. I'm gonna just copy just to.
I might have gotten there eventually, but I don't know. I was aiming for something like that.
Oh.
you have to go outside, that's the whole thing, you have to go outside of the box.
Can I show you my solution?
Yeah.
You fold the paper,
Yeah.
and then you go.
Yeah.
And if you have a wide enough pen, you've gotten all the lines.
Show the
Oh.
picture.
Could you do that?
So that the dots go together
Mm-hmm.
and they share a line.
Yes.
And again, one of the reasons for using this and characterizing it is that sometimes we see something, we see these lines, we see these dots, and we think that we have to stay within the space of the box. And I don't know about any of you, but I do know that I can get fixated on what I have come to perceive as the limits. I'm seeing you shake your head. So, and where do the limits come from? I tried to sing about it a little bit in my song. I mean, when infants arrive, it's either crying or smiling. There isn't a whole lot of variety. There is just, well, yes, they're sleeping, but I mean, usually when they're sleeping, there's a little smile there. But as we go through life, we get into the habit of learning how to please others. Is that a finger raised for a comment, or?
No, I'm still trying to work out the chart.
Oh, actually, this one should have gone all the way.
Okay.
Well, it doesn't have
Yeah,
to.
that's well.
All right, sorry.
And Michael can also show the video. There's a little YouTube video. Make it full size.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, connect.
Thank you, sorry.
Is that website called, can you solve it? Is that, I mean, is that the YouTube thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We do that, because otherwise it's exciting.
And actually, I mean, the other thing about that particular thing is you could also wrap it on a cylinder, and you could use a single line
That's
to create
Oh, that's
a spiral. So the notion is that many times we have come to have limits imposed, and it can prevent us from seeing or understanding what's out there in the possible. With the conversation, with the issue around abundance, I think that we frequently get caught into little boxes about what abundance is and about how it can show up in our lives. One of my favorite stories in the Torah, the Old Testament for the Christian or people with a Christian background, Torah for the Jewish tradition, was the story of Abraham. And Abraham was promised that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars in the heavens and the grains of sand in the desert. Now that's quite an expanse. Can you imagine even trying to count the grains of sand in a bowl, much less the grains of sand in a desert? How many of us have ever sat on a starry night and started counting? It's like, okay, yeah. And how many of us have ever lost track of the count that we're keeping? I used to work in my dad's factory, and one of the responsibilities that I had when I was little was I was supposed to keep count of the little things that we were producing. And you'd have to keep accurate count because that's what he was selling, and he was selling it by the quantity. So if I miscounted, that meant a difference in terms of the income. We get fixated on counting and doing things in a certain way. And what I want to propose is that to the extent that we stay inside of boxes, to the extent that we follow those rules that have gotten established for us, we cut ourselves off from that abundance. In the story of Abram, who became Abraham, it wasn't simply that he would get these countless descendants. He had to do a certain something. He had to leave his home. And I would say metaphysically, leaving his home was being able to think outside of the box. We've got those 9 dots. How many of us can count the kinds of responsibilities that we've got, and it sets a limit on our lives? Part of our money may go towards rent or mortgage. Part of our money may go towards electric and utility. Part of it may go to a credit. I'm sure you can kind of count down where it is that we have limits on life coming in around us, and how that can have us feeling trapped. I have tortured Reverend Mykal for the past 13 days because BBC is producing the 13th season of Doctor Who. And Doctor Who is a character who has a series of companions, and he invites his companions to think outside of the box. And the way that they think outside of the box is literally going inside of a box. But when they get inside of the box, they realize that it's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. That's usually the first thing. Oh my gosh, it's bigger on the inside than on the outside. He was surprised when one person finally came in and said, it's smaller on the outside. They turned it around because every other character except Clara had been saying, it's bigger on the inside. And he got so used to his companions coming in and meeting him and learning about this huge infinite space on the inside. And again, metaphysically, the huge infinite space that each of us are on the inside. And her comment was, it's smaller on the outside. How many of us realize that we are smaller on the outside than what we are on our inside? We are this infinity, each of us. One of the things that you may or may not know, depending on your status as a Whovian, is that a feature of Doctor Who is that the character, his body changes. You know, in some shows there was Bewitched, and I don't know if anybody ever saw Bewitched, but Samantha was a witch and she was married to a human named Darren, and the actor who played Darren changed. In once, you know, there was the old Darren at one season, and then there was the new Darren, but there was never any mention of it. This completely different looking person, but he was still Darren. Now, the Doctor Who was very explicit. Look, he's changing. He's a completely different actor. It was one of those really interesting things that this show decided that they would have this completely different actor, and it became part of the byline. One of the things that I saw this morning, isn't it great how the world works out? It's that he was ready to transition from the body that he had, and he said, we all have 1,000 different lives. We all have 1,000 different lives, an infinite number of lives. We just don't pay attention to it. Can any of us think of a time we looked in the mirror and what we saw then is not what we see now?
Oh.
Okay, that got quite a reaction there. But so if we are infinite on the inside, even our outside has an infinite number of varieties and expressions. I mean, I know about myself that I can certainly look back and say, wow, look at that hair. I really went out looking like that. Or pictures of choices of clothing, choices of style, looking back and thinking, wow, I'm surprised I didn't get more comments. I literally, at one point, I did have a coworker. I was growing my hair for Locks for Love, and she said, if you hadn't cut it then, I was going to lead an intervention. I was really concerned about you, Vaughan. And you know, there needed something had to happen. When we think of abundance as stuff, it sets a box around us. It sets a limit in terms of what our experience can be. So my first invitation is to keep this little paper as a reminder about how we can get fixated on a limit and get fixated on the boxes. How our expectations and the way that we live in the world sets a limit up for us. The second thing we're connected with noticing how we get stuck in boxes is to just track and pay attention to what happens when we do that. the trick about doing that is just to become aware, to notice it, to pay attention. And then we're at a choice point. Have I stepped inside of a box? Have I stopped myself? Have I limited myself? And then to make a conscious choice. I'm in this box. What is it serving? Am I serving an old history? Am I serving an old story? Am I serving an old commitment? What am I doing? And then we can make a conscious choice. Rather than just finding ourselves morning after morning, moment after moment, in limits. To the extent that we find ourselves limited that way, we have cut ourselves off from the experience of abundance. But the access back to abundance is as simple as noticing and then choosing. Third thing actually, because I was talking about noticing and then choosing. The concept of abundance. How many of us have it tied up in connection with a particular thing or particular things in the world? The definition is a lot of stuff. Abundance, bounty, it's a lot of stuff. How many of us hold on to definitions of a certain quality of abundance? That abundance is the materials that we own, that abundance is the dollars that are accessible through our bank accounts, our checking accounts, our credit card limits, what it is that we owe banks, what it is that we have. How many of us find ourselves calculating abundance? We live in a society that really asks us, what is your net worth? You know, do you have more than what you owe? It's one of the things that Northern Light Spiritual Center does each month. The core council gets together and looks, okay, what is it that's in the bank account? What is it that we owe? Are we in the black? Are we in the red? Where are we? One of the traps of abundance is that it can come to mean something very specific. Like I was describing with the Whovian and the Doctor Who's, one of the features of that show is that there's traveling. And there is traveling to all different kinds of places. There's traveling back in time to when dinosaurs roamed the earth. There is traveling forward in time to when there is only a single star in all of the heavens and all of creation. There's traveling to Victorian England. They do that a lot. I think that steampunk Victorian England is just a very interesting thing to the creators of Doctor Who. The thing about the motif of the show is that it does give a vehicle for stepping into and looking at times and places and people that we don't think about, that we don't notice. How the 1950s were different than the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the noughts than even the teens that we're in now. That these times keep changing, and these times are an expression of abundance. There's an abundance of knowledge that is available to us now that wasn't available 30 years ago. There's an abundance of choices that we can make. Nancy, you were describing about how you and your sister could sign up for that healthier life in 6 weeks. I didn't know how available that was 30 years ago.
It looked different if it was.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
true.
I'm trying to think. Okay, so So 50 years ago, when I was first about to be diagnosed with diabetes, the options, the treatments that were available for that little boy were extraordinarily different than they are for me in my 50s. As a person in my 50s, I've had a transplant as a way to cope with it. I don't know if you've seen it, but on TV they have an ad that, you know, you can literally take the glucometer, you can hold it on your arm, and it'll give you a glucose reading. And it's continuous. It just reads it. It's connected into your body, and it just is constantly figuring out what your glucose was. Those 50 years ago, the only really there were two ways to find it out. One was you peed on a stick, and the other was that you went into a lab, you had the blood drawn, and you had a fair amount of blood. It wasn't a little amount of blood.
Oh.
And then they would spin the blood, and they would get the plasma, and then they would test the plasma, and it took a while. It wasn't something that you could just do like that. I mean, nowadays I've got a little device here. This little thing connects to my cell phone. 15 seconds, this little device connects to my cell phone. 15 seconds, I, put in a little strip, a little meter strip, and I get the account on my phone.
Oh.
And it keeps a log, it keeps a track, it keeps a graph, all of that.
I love it.
Wow.
You know,
How easy
so
is this?
Yeah. You still have to stick yourself and put blood on that though.
I do. That's
Tiny
what.
bit.
Boy,
Just a
that's
tiny bit.
That's what
I
this. That's what.
Yeah, right.
That's what this is for. Or it was finding a vein. It was taking out.
Yeah.
It was taking it out into a glass vial. It was taking the glass vial. It was spinning it in a centrifuge. It was taking that spin centrifuge, and it was then adding the appropriate ingredients, and it was studying it, and it took a day or two to get the results.
Oh, oh my. Oh.
15 seconds.
Finger prick, stick on this, 15 seconds. I characterize this as a way to show that we are constantly living in a field of abundance. That the knowledge that is expanding is a field of abundance. One of the things that I debated whether to say this or not, and you know me in my debates, I usually will end up choosing to say it anyhow, is that I have a certain amount of abundance afforded me by virtue of my skin color and my gender. There are things that are endowed to me through nothing apart from what my parents looked like and the fact that I was born male. It's called privilege. And I bring this up because sometimes religious science gets into this notion that it's all equal for everybody. And I think that is a gross simplification, and it actually contributes to social injustices. Because we live in a social matrix where there are social status features that have gotten established, and unless people of privilege like me, a white man, stands up and says, this has got to stop. That notion that there's abundance available for all. Well, what was available for Trayvon Martin? The person who killed Trayvon Martin had very minimal consequences. He had access to justice that other people don't have. Trayvon Martin did not have access to that same justice. I have a colleague on Facebook, and I've become very intentional about the notion Black Lives Matter. And this particular colleague is like, all lives matter. And I know I've talked about this before in service, but the fact is that the notion of the Black Lives Matter movement is that it's Black Lives Matter also. It isn't that Black Lives Matter and nobody else's lives matter. And that's how the apprehensive, fearful, white, male-dominant community looks at it and tries to push it out as a reaction. Instead of saying, yes, all lives matter, but the fact is, as the metaphor has been used, when a house is burning in a neighborhood, you don't go with the fire truck and spray water on every house in the neighborhood. You spray it on the house that's burning. And Black Lives Matter is an opportunity, it's a movement to look at where the fire is. Where is the injustice happening? The Me Too movement. Standing up in the face of sexual violence. Abundance, in my mind, is about producing an abundance of justice. Producing a world that really does work for everybody. And to have a world that works for everybody doesn't mean just simply remaining mute in the face of injustice. At the place where my daughter works, Seattle Children's Theater, they have a little sign on the wall that says, white privilege doesn't mean that your bad experience didn't happen. It just means that it wasn't aggravated by your skin tone. I think one of the notions of abundance is that we can move forward together to create a world where there's more justice in the world. So just like I talked about finding ourselves boxed in by our choices, it isn't only our individual choices, it's the choice of the social systems that we find ourselves living in. How do we, when we have the place and the time, how do we be conscientious about being messengers of abundance? How do we become the voice of justice and abundance for all, rather than abundance for me? When the founder of religious science, Earnest Holmes, was operating, there were all kinds of social injustices that were at play. One of the things about Earnest Holmes was that he made a choice to stand up. There were African American churches that were teaching his teaching, and there were some white folk who were kind of feeling hostile about it. So Earnest Holmes went to the church not to preach, but to be there and listen, to be witness to it, to say amen when they were saying amen, to be present to it. And people were like, Ernest, do you want to be connected this way? And he's like, yes, I do. Earnest Holmes, the person who founded this faith, made choices around racial equity. There's a part of this movement where people are very much adhere to the notion of it's a very individual teaching, and it's about making it happen well in our own lives. What I want to say is that abundance, what I want to say for me and what I'm inviting for us is that abundance is not only a personal abundance, but it's an abundance where we become a contagion of abundance. We become a contagion of justice. One of the things that I've come to really love about Doctor Who, he goes to deliver kindness. He goes to deliver help when people are in need. He sometimes lands in the middle of situations and it's not what he was planning. We're going to Rome. He ends up in Pompeii.
Oh.
Mount Vesuvius is about to blow up. And he realizes that if he doesn't stop it from blowing up, these aliens in the past are going to take over all of the earth. And he's like, this shouldn't happen. But it means that Mount Vesuvius has to blow. So he's personally responsible. Doctor Who is personally responsible for Mount Vesuvius.
Oh.
He doesn't feel happy about that. But his companion says, can't you save anybody? If you save somebody, won't it make a difference? And he does. Sometimes abundance is not about, sometimes the abundance that we can deliver might not hit the whole world. It might not hit the whole society. And that doesn't make it any less powerful or any less useful. My invitation is that abundance, if it just stops with us, there's less power in that than abundance that reaches out and touches others. Now, while I do believe that our presence of being places of abundance can be a powerful example, it's like that notion of being stuck with our limits. We see what it is, we stop, and we decide, do I stay here or do I step out? I would say the same thing in terms of the social structures in which we live. Is what I have, does it impose and does it set limits for others? So in schools, when somebody brings a student forward to me and they say, I think this kid has a disability, I have to ask them. I have to engage with them and say, is it really a disability or is it just that they have a different set of supports in place? Is our calling them disabled going to change that? If you don't think there's something really going on other than that, there are other things that we can do. And that's what we should do rather than labeling somebody as disabled. Each one of us are in situations where we get to bring more abundance. And you name the kind, the abundance of health, the abundance of wisdom, the abundance of wholeness, the abundance of kindness, the abundance of love. Each one of us gets to be places of that. And we get to have it be bigger than just for ourselves. We get to be places that spreads it out to the world. And so it is.
So it is.